Hey guys, welcome back to my messy bench. While playing around with electronics today, I ran into an interesting situation. Well, I've known that my house doesn't have some grounded outlets. Some areas it does, some areas it don't. The newer areas have grounded outlets and the older parts of the house doesn't. Well, my house was built before the Great War, World War II. And they only use two wires, a hot and a neutral. There is no safety ground, so the ground on many of the outlets is left floating. So like my power supply casing, the shield grounds on the scope, the case of my computer and things are really a floating ground. And because sometimes I use small value capacitors from hot to ground, or just bundled wires running, the hot and ground running next to each other might capacitively induce a voltage on the ground line. And I blew out a chip amp. I was playing with a AM little radio receiver here. It's got a coil and a variable capacitor. And what happens is I wanted to amplify its output with a chip amp. Of course, that thing is grounded with a true earth ground. And when I hooked up my power supply, because of that, there's a floating voltage of about 60 volts or so. Somehow got into the input of the chip amp. Probably when I connected the input of this, the output of that, and I was powering off something connected to the mains. Well, that 60 volts went in and popped the chip and degraded this transistor, or I just got distortion from that point. So, yeah, that's what damaged the chip. Another thing interesting is I'm playing with this op amp now. I was building a circuit, and when I turned on the function generator feeding its input, if you would listen carefully, I just knocked out my power in here. I knocked everything out just from this chip amp. And it didn't do that before, but you heard, what you were hearing was the output of that chip going through my computer speakers. Well, that was interesting. I knocked out my computer. I turned it on and it booted up okay, so no harm done. That was quite interesting. Knocked the power out. Well, what's going on here is I connected the floating ground to the output of this chip. I did it first when I was trying to measure with my scope, because the output's bridged and I connected the ground side of the scope to one side of the chip output and the other end to the other op amp. It's one of those dual op amp chips. And what ended up happening is I was actually driving that floating ground with the output of the chip. And even though the computer amplifier has shielded inputs, because of the ground is varying, and injected some of that signal into the chip. So what knocked out the power? That was very unexpected, but it makes sense now that I found the source. What happened was there's a GFCI, ground fault circuit interrupter plug, outside on my back patio, and it feeds all these circuits in here. So what happens is when I injected that signal and I turned the amplitude up enough current was flowing from the chip amp through the GFCI and it triggered it. So, let's try that again. I have my computer turned off. There it goes, knocked it right out. Seems to be more sensitive now. wasn't doing that earlier. Well, hang on, let me reset. So how much voltage is floating naturally on the ground? So I connected my meter across the earth ground and this floating ground, and it looks like about 59 volts. So if I put my meter on the case of my power supply, 59 volts, and the shield of the scope connector there, 59 volts, and it'd be on my computer case and everything else. Let me check another thing. Okay, now I put a 100k ohm resistor from earth ground to the floating ground, and it dropped the voltage a little bit, about 51 volts. So that's not insignificant current. There's about half a milliamp. I mean, it's not anything great or dangerous, but yeah, it's enough to blow out a input of an audio amp, putting that kind of voltage on it. I mean, the input of a audio amp chip can be around 100k, 150, somewhere around there. So yeah, what I need to do is to ground this circuit. I'm going to have to figure out how to do that, because it can cause problems. I never really had any problems until I just noticed this issue today after living here all these years. But yeah, it's just funny things you run into. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching.